Hi, everybody. Welcome to Inside Scoop with Sue. Today, I am here with Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. Roni, I forgot to ask you, do you have a copy of your book you get to hold up?
Oh, I do actually. I just got one.
Yay! This book is coming out next week, right?
Yes, it's coming out Tuesday.
Exciting. Anything but my phone, Mom. Move it over a little so we can see the cover. Raising
Oh, wrong way.
Raising emotionally resilient daughters in the digital age. So we actually thank you, Ronnie, and you're giving us some books to give out. So anybody listening, put your email me actually at editor@yourteenmag.com. And I will post that in the comments, or if Jessica's on, she will put it there for everybody. Editor@yourteenmag.com to get entered into the raffle for a copy of this brand new, wonderful book. So let me introduce Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with decades of experience treating adolescents and adults, and one of my favorites, specializing in one of the many things she specializes in, mother-daughter relationships. Your first book, I'm Not Mad, I Just Hate You. I remember seeing the title and just feeling comforted by the title that I was not the only one whose child
Yes.
felt that way about me. And as I said, her brand new book is launching next week, which is super exciting. And so, I just want to talk about mothers and daughters to start with. Why does it feel like the tension is inevitable?
Well, I have to say that in all those decades of experience, I have met a few mothers and daughters who did not have this tension, but we're talking about a very low percentage. So I think the rest of us have really felt it. And, developmentally, Sue, it really makes sense because during adolescence, teens are trying to figure out who they are and who they don't want to be. And who do they look at as their closest role model? They look at their moms. And so they're scrutinizing us, everything we say, everything we do, everything we wear, because they want to figure out, like, I am not my mom. And so it never feels better than to differentiate themselves, like, I am not my mom. And so, of course, there's just tension. And on the other side of it, they also feel like we're scrutinizing them. Are you okay? How are you feeling? How come you're not telling me how you're feeling? Why won't you talk to me? Is there anything you're not telling? I mean, so it goes on both senses. And so the result is that I find that a mother daughter relationship is so unique and so much more intense than other relationships, even, father daughter and mother son. We have the ability to make each other so happy when our relationships are going well, right? We never feel more joyful. And when they're not going well, it is so, so painful.
Yes, yes. And so today in this next half hour, what we're hoping to do is give moms some tools for how to navigate that space that can really hurt us. I mean, it really feels terrible. So let's just
Exactly.
start with the title of the book. So your new book is, I mean, anything but my phone, Mom, is so grabbing. You really understand where that's coming from. How does that relate to building resilience in our daughters?
Well, you're right that I wanted that title so much because when I work with mothers and daughters, when I interviewed a bunch of mothers and daughters to write this book, and universally that came up as the most important issue for both teens and women. Okay. And so I really felt like it captured this conflict that's going on because most mothers today were not raised with cell phones and social media, right? We were using landlines to call our friends and we were hanging out at the mall. And so, mothers today who are trying to keep their kids safe and trying to understand what's going on in social media, they feel really at a disadvantage. And on the other half of it, you have the daughters who have grown up with this kind of media. Cyberspace is their home. And so the thought for them of being separated from these conduits to connection and contentment is unthinkable. And so you have this push pull going on all the time. And, personally, I am so grateful that my kids are not teens anymore. They're grown adults. I have such empathy for mothers and daughters trying to work this out. On the other hand, I have this really strong optimism because I think that working these kinds of conflicts through, talking them through, is the process by which we help our daughters to become more competent, more confident, and most of all, more socially resilient.
Okay, that's so great. I'm picturing as you're talking about this, the pain I felt, the rejection I felt when my kid was texting, like on her phone as I'm talking to her. Like I'm not worth
Yes.
the attention. So I see the connection is strong. Brianna makes two really strong points. One of them is because we see so much of ourselves and our emotions take over. My daughter and I love hate one another, which I think is very common. And then this one, I'm going to just share this from Brianna. I'm trying to raise a strong and resilient daughter who stands up for herself, even when it means standing up to me. That is,
Brilliant.
yeah.
That is so brilliant. And I want to comment on that because I think that it is so crucial. It's rare, I think, for moms to recognize that this is how our girls practice. They practice at the dinner table. We want them to be able to communicate like that in the boardroom. It starts at the dinner table. But for so many moms who were raised by mothers who didn't tolerate what they called talking back and what I would call really healthy inquiry, like, why do you feel this way? Why are you saying no? They're not challenging you in your terms of your authority. They're trying to figure out your thinking. And so it's harder for mothers who were raised like that to tolerate and even to think that when daughters behave like that with us, it's such a positive thing.
Yeah, that's a really tough one to see. Really tough to
Yes.
see. Like, I want to send you out in the world really bold and strong and confident, but I don't really want you using those tools at me. Like, save them for out there. But that is where they get practice. So, one of the things in your book, you have a section titled "Don't Take It Personally," and I know that's at the core of so much of what goes on in these relationships. And I know that the moments when I'm doing my best parenting, I am stepping back from that. But those moments are very few and far between. Like most of the time, someone's walking me off the cliff, someone's talking me down because I'm like, I'm never cooking for them again. I'm all these nevers of like, because they just hurt me so badly. So how do we move from feeling like it's a mutual relationship to kind of like pulling back and saying, I've got to be the grown up here? Is that what we have to do anyway? Let's start with that.
Yes, I think you're right. It is a mutual relationship to a point. And what I mean by that is that we have to be accountable for our behavior toward our daughters, right? And they have to be accountable for their behavior toward us. There are certain limits that we set. We don't want them to walk all over us. We don't want them to mistreat us. We're trying to teach them, in fact, how to be good people, right? But on the other hand, if we think of the relationship as mutual in terms of like a friendship, then we're missing a very important point. We can be friendly with our teens, but we can't be friends with them. We're always their mothers, okay? And that means stepping back and recognizing that not everything is directed toward us. Because they love us and they know that we love them unconditionally, they know that they can take things out on us. They know that they can take liberties with us that they wouldn't take with other people. And so I think you hear that when your experience of your daughter is a little bit different from what other people say to you, like her teachers or the parents of her friends who say, "Oh, she's always so lovely, she's always so polite." That's what I tell parents you're aiming for, because if they can do it in someone else's house, you're doing a good job. But let me just say, I think it's easier said than done not to take it personally. And I think that the more distance you get from the teenage years, when your daughter, and I know it's hard to wait, but I've had this experience now personally. So I can say that I felt like with this book, I was able to really reassure parents that you can come a long way from adolescence. And that's not really going to be the case anymore.
It's true, but it's so hard to believe that. Like, I also can look back and say, like, the relationships have turned into something much greater after they left adolescence. But in the thick of it, I just said and did some terrible things because I was so hurt. Like, it's so hard to put the emotion aside when we live with them. They're,
Yes.
and they're like kind of our project, right? Like it's like
Yes.
it's really
Yes,
hard.
there's no question. I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have people in your life who you can confide in about this. And it's not easy these days in this culture, right? We sort of want to only tell people the good things about our daughters or how we get along, right? But it is important to have people that you can trust, because when you find out that this is going on in other relationships, you can't fantasize that you're the only one this is happening to, right? And so it does normalize it a little bit. I think that's the saving grace.
Yeah, I think someone once said to me, "You're not special," and I was a little taken aback, but I was also, very comforted by the idea that this was not specific to me as a human being, but like that we all struggle with it. So, because of your title, I thought a lot about the phone, right? And some people say, or it used to be more popular to say, "Take it away," right? And now
Right.
there's like this feeling that it's an extension of your body. It's like you're tied to the world, and it's so onerous to take it away. But is there ever a time where it makes sense? Like Tamara says, maybe you need a family detox, a digital detox. Like, is there ever a time where that makes sense to impose on your kid?
Oh, that is such a it's a great question, and I have so much to say about that. So I'm going to try to be succinct there. So I think the best thing that you can do is, and this works better when your kids are very young, is to have a discussion before the first cell phone is given to your child, right? Where you come up with kind of a family guideline around how media is going to be used. And I think it's very important to treat it as any other sort of consumption. I mean, yes, it's healthy to eat vegetables, but if you're only eating vegetables, that's not healthy either. And the same thing with media. So I think it's important to set parameters. They'll be different for every family, but as a guideline, I think you want to make sure that the family interactions are in the moment and really connected to one another. So I wouldn't allow, let's say, cell phones at the dinner table, or when you're doing a family activity together, especially vacations, things like that. So it's better to set those boundaries than to have to come in later and then take things away. I think it's important to tell teens or preteens, or whenever they get the cell phone, that you're going to be monitoring things, and it's up to you to help them to use it safely. And so if you feel that they're not, you may need to pull back for a while, but you're not going to do it indiscriminately. And when you do it, you're going to talk to them about what they need to do differently to earn back that privilege. Okay? Does that
Yeah,
make
it's very
sense?
kind. Well, it just sounds kind. It doesn't sound punitive. It's like this is a learning moment as opposed to like, I can't believe what you just did, and I'm taking away your phone because I have the power over you. It's doesn't
Yeah,
sound
that doesn't work very well, because teens just become angry and resentful, and so they're less likely to learn the lesson. But I think the you just hit on a very important thing about not being punitive. You want to ally with your daughter about this. You want to say, "Look, we're figuring this out together, and you'll make mistakes, I'll make mistakes, and we both need to correct them." Because you don't want them to live in fear of having their connections lost, to their friends. I mean, and there are some very positive things. I mean, they're using their phones these days for school also.
right. Carrie, Brianna says we don't take away the phone, but we set limits and turn it off. If you can't respect the rules set by both parties, then you don't get it. And I want to say, like, the best time is when you first hand them a phone. But if you're
Yes.
listening right now and you miss that moment, you can tell them you just listened to this great interview with Dr. Cohen-Sandler, and she suggested this. So we don't miss the moment. It might
Oh,
not be what you think.
absolutely not. And I think that that's true of so many things. So many times I think the pressure on moms is, this is happening right now. I have to do this right. I have to say the right thing. And I think one of the things that's so important to hear is that sometimes in those moments, it's not the best time to bring something up, but to say, I need to really think about this for a few minutes and I'll get back to you. And when you get back to your kid and you have a more rational reason for something and your anger has lowered a little bit, those are the best moments to talk about these things.
Okay, so Carrie, I'm going to share her comment because it's, we've all dealt with this. Like lockdowns had, the only thing our kids had to stay connected were their phones. So, how do you navigate that?
Yes. Well, I think that during the pandemic, it was an entirely different set of priorities where teens' mental health was being affected by their inability to be with peers from whom they get a lot of support. And the isolation was causing a lot of anxiety and depression. The statistics on this are off the charts. And also, their media use really increased for 12 to 13-year olds, it almost doubled during the pandemic. And I think it's okay to say, look, these are extraordinary, circumstances. If your child comes down with COVID or mono or whatever, yes, they're going to use more social media. Those times call for it. But it's a matter of saying, okay, well, now you're back in school. And so we want to make sure that you have a more balanced life. It's not that media is bad in and of itself. It's just that if they're gaming 24/7, then they're not sleeping, they're not eating well, and they're not enjoying the outside. They're not getting exercise. They're not playing the piano or whatever music. You know what I mean? I mean, it's what they're missing. So you have to get
Oh,
them back on balance.
that is so good. We always talk about the other side of that, but what are you giving up? Like a walk outside if you can't pull yourself away from your phone, right? Like, what are you giving
Right.
up? I love that. That's excellent. Okay, so I think daughters have this like incredibly gold medal while we're in the Olympics talent to push our buttons. Um, and
For
like,
sure.
eh, why is that so easy for them to do? And you also talk about um, strategies for coping. So help us.
Okay. So, girls are excellent. I think they're savants at pushing our buttons, really. And I think that happens because in this culture, and it's a good and a bad thing, in this culture, they're socialized to read our expressions, to be really attuned to people's emotions, far more, I think, than boys. Boys are so much more straightforward. If they're annoyed about something, they'll just go and tell you. But the other reason for this, I think, is that there's still a huge double standard in this culture about anger. And girls are not supposed to be angry. They're not supposed to express anger. They're supposed to be sugar and spice and everything nice, especially the nice part. And so a lot of their aggression kind of goes underground. It becomes passive aggression, microaggression. And as I said, they have all these tools available to them because they're so good at reflecting our flaws, right? They're scrutinizing them. And so it is really something else to experience this sort of thing because it usually comes out of nowhere. You're unprepared for it. And your reactions, I say the first thing that you should do is sort of identify the trigger. So, did your daughter say something that was critical of you? Did she ask an overly personal question? And these are all very provocative. When you're hearing something like this. The second thing I think it's important to do is to pay attention to what your reaction is. So, do you feel just sort of frozen and you don't know what to say? Or do you hear yourself saying things that you wish you weren't saying or channeling somebody that you don't want to emulate? Are you shaking? Are you having physical reactions? For some people, it can just feel like, you're feeling red in the face. For other people, it can feel like you've been hit by a bus. Um, so I think it's important to postpone conversations in this moment because your body is feeling a threat, right? And so your brain is secreting all of these stress hormones, and the thinking part of your brain has just gone on hiatus. So postpone conversations. Remember that you can discuss this in 5 minutes, in an hour, in 2 days. It's still going to be okay. Um, be the grown up with emotional control is really important because you're trying to teach your daughter, right, how to handle these kind of situations where you've said something, the other person has a reaction to it, and you need to be able to talk about it in a way that's appropriate. Um, and then I say, be truthful. So you want to get at the bottom of this. I mean, why did your daughter just ask you, how many people you slept with before you got married? Or, you know, was it coming from nowhere? Or was she actually thinking about her own sexuality? That kind of thing. Um, and so if she does ask you a question that you feel uncomfortable with, I think it's important not to lie, because you want to teach her to tell the truth and you want to have a mutually trusting relationship. But also, you don't have to tell her things that you're not comfortable with. And so it's okay to say, I'm not really comfortable, discussing that with you now, maybe when you get older. Or you can say, I'm really interested in why you want to know that. Are you thinking about yourself or something like that? Um, and the last one I say is
My
no,
favorite, my favorite.
know when to stop talking. And I have to say, this was generated from my own mistakes. Okay. Because I had a problem with this. My daughter was like a clam. You know, Here I was seeing teens in therapy for decades, and they would always bare their souls to me. And my own teenager never said a word. And so I would think the harder I tried, of course, it just backfired. And so, what I tell parents now is be realistic. If the conversation is going nowhere, if your daughter can't tolerate that emotional intimacy, or she can't really access her own feelings, just know when to say, okay, this is enough. We'll talk about this another time. It's never one conversation, it's many conversations at different times.
Yeah, I think like for the partner I have in raising our kids, he cannot stop. I'm like I'm like in the background going, you said it, now move on. But it's like over and over and over again. Um, okay, so I think this is one of the pain points often in life is when our kids don't match us. Like there's a mom who loves to read and a kid who loves to ride horses, and like that mom always dreamt of sitting on the couch together while they'd be reading. And
Mm.
introvert or extrovert or social or shy or all of those things that they're likely to appear in your kids, that you are not the same person. And yet it's still a shock to us, and it still kind of feels almost like a little bit of a betrayal. Like if I can convince you to be like me, we'll have these bonding things I dreamt of.
You have to separate exactly what you said. Your dream for your child, your hope for your child, perhaps even before she was a reality, and then mothering the daughter you really have. Because I think, first of all, it is more challenging to have a daughter who's different from us. I'm very talkative. My daughter didn't talk, right? I'm very emotional. She wrote about her emotions rather than speaking them. And so it makes it more challenging because we know what we know ourselves. And so raising a child who's different from us is just going to take more thought. But knowing that, I mean, I love your question because you recognize that these differences exist. And that's half the battle, because the real problem comes in when mothers don't recognize that and they want to create a clone or a mini me. And so what they're doing is they're always asking and expecting their daughters to be different from who they really are. And that creates a lot of problems, not just in the relationship, but in how daughters feel about themselves. Because if moms are trying to take square pegs and put them in round holes, then daughters always feel like they're lacking in some way and that they're never going to please their mothers.
I think like I mean I can just say from my perspective, with one of my kids, they're like you and your daughter, and I just thought she needed to be taught. Like if I just explain how this works, but it wasn't. It was really a temperament difference, right? And so
Correct.
once I recognized that, I could love that and not think that it had to be changed. But it's hard for us, especially with our first kids, to know that, oh, this is not like a training moment, like a
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. And it's very rare for them to change. You're right. It's more of a temperament thing.
yeah.
I'm working with a young lady now who is just very quiet and reserved, and her mother is constantly furious with her because her mother is taking it personally and thinks that her daughter just doesn't want to talk to her. But the reality is, no, her daughter is just not a talker.
Yeah. Yeah, that I could say personally that's a rough one. Okay, I'm sorry I
Yes.
don't know how to pronounce your name. Isa? I go into the other room, calm down, then tell her how I felt about it, and then we have a nice talk. That sounds great.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That sounds so beautiful.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Okay, so I think that we often can live in a space with a lot of criticism, right? Like, and it can feel like breathing is a problem, chewing is a problem, the way you smiled, the way you spoke to somebody, so much criticism. But there are things we are doing wrong. Maybe not what our kids are telling us, but what are we getting wrong when we're looking at this mother-daughter relationship?
What I would say is plenty. And the reason I say that, I am quoting one of my first supervisors when I was in training, and she had a little saying that even the perfect mother stinks. And I love that because it really encapsulates the fact that we can be trying our best and yet we're human. And so I think the biggest mistake that we make, and it's inevitable sometimes, is an empathic failure where we're not quite getting what's happening with our daughters and they don't feel understood. And of course, they have an expectation that we are going to understand them at all times, if not read their minds, right? And so we have to realize that we're going to have those failures of empathy. But I think that if we try our best to be very mindful and in the moment when we're having these conversations with our daughters, not thinking about other things, not thinking about how we're going to respond, but just really listening to them and reflecting back, and we do our best, that's part of it. And the other part of it is I think it's so imperative for us to be self-reflective and to acknowledge when we have failed them in some way. And when we acknowledge that, it just does so much wonders for the relationship because then girls don't feel, as they often do, that their mothers are blaming them for everything. It really feels so authentic to kids, and they just benefit from it.
Are there any like language, like phrases that you defaulted to that you express to your clients? Like, say things like this. Like, I know being curious, but what does being curious look like? Like, how do we engage our girls differently so that they really have a chance for us to show empathy? They really understand it.
So if they say something, don't automatically assume that you know exactly what they're saying or how they're feeling. And so you can say, well, I think what you're saying is this, but help me to understand it better. I want to make sure that I'm really getting it. Or, you said this, but it makes me wonder about this. So you're following up in a way, and you're not trying to pinpoint them. These aren't specific questions where it's going to be a yes or a no. And so you're giving them a chance to think about it a little bit and think about how to explain something more fully. And sometimes they can't do that, right? Like with daughters who are not talkers. And so for them, I think it's sometimes helpful to give them a little menu. Say, I don't want to make assumption about how you're feeling, but I'm not quite sure I understand. Is it more that you're feeling angry? Is it more that you're feeling disappointed? Is it more that you're feeling resentful? You give them a menu of terms, and that is really helpful in terms of increasing their emotional vocabulary. And in fact, I felt this is so important that I actually have a chart in my book about emotions because girls very often will just know like sad, mad, glad, right? But they need to have more sophisticated language now, and that really captures exactly how they're feeling and also the intensity of their feelings. And so I think that when you can be curious like that in a non-judgmental kind of way, that promotes conversation.
Yeah, I love that. And also we're having a book raffle, so and there's a link in the chat for also just purchasing the book. You're definitely going to want to see that chart. I'm going to share this question because it is such a good one. Thanks, Candace. How do you balance parental expectations such as grades with not affecting your daughter's self-esteem?
Oh my gosh, that is such a great question. I agree. I think, first of all, you have to have a realistic expectation about grades. Um, Many parents, I think, believe that if kids are bright and they do their work, they're always going to get A's. And that's really not the case anymore. I think that there's a whole lot of other things going on in the school level and that kind of thing. But also not to use the grades as the be all and end all, because they often don't reflect the work that someone's putting in. So I would say use grades as just as a communication, as let's talk about this. Were you happy with this grade? Did you understand the material? What does this mean? Sometimes the teachers grade very harshly or very, there's no rhyme or reason to it. So I think that you have to have a relationship where you're talking about the big picture, which is that you want kids to have a love of learning. You want them to be curious, and you don't want them, this is the most important thing, you don't want them to be afraid of making mistakes. And so if you treat mistakes as an inevitable and important part of the learning process, and you're not disappointed in the mistakes, but you say, well, what did you learn from this? What are you going to do differently next time? Then kids are going to have much more investment in learning, and they're going to want to excel for themselves as well as to please parents.
Okay, well, we have gone past our 30 minutes and you have shared so much helpful advice. Ejipi says, this is very helpful. Communicating effectively with my teen is a priority to me. We're so glad you put that down there. And we hope that everyone listening feels they're a little better equipped than they were before they got on. Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks for having me.